Hello, I'm Joycelyn Longdon, a third-year PhD candidate at the University of Cambridge, and today I present justice-oriented design listening, participatory ecoacoustics for the Ghanaian forest community. I present on behalf of my co-authors and collaborators, and note that this work is part of the AI for Environmental Risk programme at Cambridge, funded by UKRI, and is conducted in collaboration with the British Trust for Ornithology, through a knowledge exchange studentship funded by the Evolution Education Trust through the Cambridge Conservation Initiative. Contributions to this paper by Michelle Westerlaken and Jennifer Gabrys were supported by funding from the European Research Council under the European Union's Horizon 2020 Research and Innovation Programme. With tropical forests playing a major role in shaping the outcomes of both the climate and biodiversity crises, measuring and monitoring have become essential practices within the field of conservation. As a result of advances in machine learning techniques and reductions in hardware costs, the field of ecoacoustics is playing an increasingly important role in monitoring biodiversity and informing conservation practices. Ecoacoustic research sees autonomous sensors deployed in forest ecosystems over extended periods to record wildlife and ecosystem sounds. Despite the long tradition of citizen participation in ecoacoustics research, particularly with bird enthusiasts, there is an asymmetrical distribution of resources, expertise, equipment, and engagement between the global north and global south. There exists a paucity of African ecoacoustics literature, and the local ecological knowledge of African forest communities remains largely understudied. In the Ghanaian context, there have been calls to prioritise traditional and indigenous Asante knowledge and practices as effective forest conservation and management practices in Ghana. The colonial and continued neo-colonial exclusion of forest communities and traditional beliefs and practices in tropical forest conservation extends the development of new technologies that are embedded in forest landscapes. Local communities are seldom involved in the technology design of conservation tools, which result in the design of non-intuitive systems, often leading to mistrust in the technology itself. There exists an opportunity for sustainable HCI researchers and participatory design practitioners to expand their methods to engage communities in the global south across the research and technology design cycle in a way that centers on justice and decolonial theories and practice. This work is framed by the core research objective to understand and generate methods of participatory design that elicit and facilitate pluralistic and culturally appropriate and informed community engagements for the design of conservation technologies. And this work is part of a longer doctoral research project reflecting on co-design and participatory sensing engagements for the forest fringe community in the Ashanti region of Ghana. Through this work, we find that current participatory design approaches are at risk of limiting participant expressions of creativity and perpetuating socially unjust dynamics within the design process. And we advocate for a researcher as a listener approach to PD in non-Western contexts. We contribute to HCI research by providing ethnographic descriptions of participatory design engagements with the tropical forest community that we work with in the development of ecoacoustic data interfaces. We describe the tensions that arise when employing visual and written modes of participatory interaction design in tropical forest contexts. And most importantly, and what I'll be focusing on in this presentation, is the presentation of justice-oriented design listening. An acoustically-oriented approach to participatory design facilitates pluralistic co-design engagements when developing and deploying conservation technologies in non-Western contexts. So our research was conducted in a community on the fringe of the Blossom Tree Range Forest Reserve in the spring seasons of 2022 and 2023. Whilst there are wider discussions within HCI and across sociology, geography, and anthropology about the use of the word community, in the Ghanaian context, community is a crucial term for Ghanaian participants to describe their relation to place. We find it important to make clear who we mean when we refer to a community, and for the engagements detailed in this paper, the community refers to a group of 12 individuals: Samotei, Kojo Apia, Yohani Kwajo, Abner Dufi, Isaka Jomani, Comfort Arko, Dana Akwa, Ya Achema, Amakodu, Agnes Yan Konsa, Akwesi Safo, and Kweku Amwa, pictured here. The objective of our field engagement was to co-design an ecoacoustic data exploration and analysis tool with community members, following popular and grounded methods of participatory and interaction design, such as workshops, probes, and prototyping, in response to concerns raised by community members within the first field season. And our engagements were designed iteratively, with each activity a response to conversations and feedback received from community members in previous sessions. It was through this process of iterative listening to community concerns, points of interest and needs, and the subsequent embedding of these responses in the design of the following workshops that that we became attuned to this approach, the concept of justice-oriented design listening. The first workshop was a prototype and feedback session. Based on the first field season, it had become clear that community members needed an interface that allowed them to explore the sounds and the soundscape of the forests rather than focus on individual species or individual species statistics. And so a unsupervised visualization based on TISNI, unsupervised machine learning clustering method was presented to community members. And that was followed by a paper prototyping session where community members were able to take inspiration from that initial prototype and start to design or highlight key features that might be important to include in the interface. This was followed by a listening session inspired by the work of Adham et al. 2018, where we explored the utility of Adinkra symbols, which are indigenous Ghanaian design concepts that encode proverbs and philosophical ideologies for sustainable education in Ghana. We were exploring the way in which that these symbols might embed ecological meanings or encode cultural visual representations that we could embed into our representations in the ecoacoustic interface. This was followed by collective mapping, a community mapping workshop where we presented formal ecoacoustic experimental sampling techniques and tried to understand how community members would approach ecoacoustic experimental design given their own ecological and sociological priorities. This was followed by the deployment of the ecoacoustic sensors, but the opportunity was taken here to turn these walks into walking conversations, serving the purpose of engaging more deeply with community needs, ideas, and thoughts that were not necessarily related to specific design itself, but wider opinions that were occurring within community conversations. And finally, based on these walking conversations, a new updated interface was designed, and these designs were fed back to community members. These designs embedded some of the main conversations that were happening in the walks, mainly around livelihood and ecotourism, and community members were able to discuss the practical requirements, missing elements, and the ways in which they could embed their local knowledge into this new interface design. Throughout these design engagements, there were several times when the suitability of the methods employed were directly or indirectly challenged by community members and proven to be problematic. Not only this, but we observed that when the oral was centered and the designer took the position of a listener, community goals, objectives, and priorities came to the fore organically. Throughout these various interactions over the course of the forest visit, it became clear that adopting an acoustic mode in which the designer moves away from being a facilitator or a leader, but assumes the role of a listener was more culturally appropriate and conducive to energetic, dynamic, and creative design experiences. We found that community members needed approaches that centered dialogue rather than drawing, where storytelling and debate was central to community creativity and planning, and that meaning making was found through walking, through activity. Over the course of these engagements, 3 major points of reflection occurred, which you can see on the screen here, leading to the conceptualization of justice-oriented design listening and its 3 modes: polyphony, pace, and transformation. These modes facilitate pluralistic design engagements between designers and marginalized communities. So the concept of justice-oriented design listening is an approach to participatory design characterized by the way in which storytelling, meaning making, and the prioritization of the oral shape design engagements in contexts where people have distinctly oral modes of engaging with, narrating, and analyzing their land practices. As well as engaging with the surrounding environment and the data that arises from sensing those environments. Justice-oriented design listening emerges by taking into consideration not only the methods taken to design specific conservation technologies, but also foregrounding how participatory design practitioners might ready themselves for working with communities where conversation and storytelling are the foundation of knowledge exchange and ideation. Our method is less about doing design and more about how we generate knowledge from design in non-Western contexts. Previously mentioned that this approach is characterized by 3 modes: polyphony, pace, and transformation. And these modes can be seen as a retooling of methods that shape participatory design research. So first, starting with polyphony. Polyphony is an approach to pluralism in the justice-oriented design and listening process. It responds to calls for plurality in the design process by decentering the designer to allow community communication mechanisms to flow in non-linear, unstructured, and multifaceted ways. When listening was prioritized, design sessions became a cacophony of ideas, questions, and rebuttals. Our conversations would follow an arc that began with one member of the group responding to a prompt or question, and then one by one, other voices been added to the mix, at times in unison, and at other times with multiple conversations occurring in parallel. During this time, the designer must become comfortable with the emergence of disharmony in conversations. There must be a tolerance for different types of cadences. In participatory design, it's often believed that there should be a harmonious, positive cadence where the result is a finalized artifact that represents the combined ideas of the group. But sometimes a cadence that is dissonant or leaves a feeling of not quite being finished, an imperfect cadence, acts as a comma and suggests that there are more conversations that are needed. What we observed was that polyphony, whether holding harmony or tension, returned to a place of stillness and without external input once the discussion was exhausted by community members themselves. Aligning with Wilde and Frederick's 2013, we find that connecting to the harmony and melody of the Song of Difference represents an Indigenous worldview within academia. And as a Karma and Light 2018 highlight, design situations are characterized by messy, uncertain, and indeterminate dilemmas, which we find emerge through this polyphonic approach to facilitated design conversations. Accepting, encouraging, and facilitating polyphony gives agency to the community and centers already existing ways in which they approach discussion, deliberation, and creative thinking, rather than imposing a more Western or organizational expectation on what design sessions might sound or look like. Moving on to pace. Pace is an approach that privileges slowness and centers community agency. It advances conversations and considerations of agency highlighted in the wider field of justice and decolonisation within participatory design with respect to timing, duration, and tempo of design activities. We find that polyphony and pace are interconnected. When plurality through storytelling, local knowledge sharing, and dialogue are centred, increased capacity and willingness for extended periods of ideation are observed. Engagements not only unfold more slowly, but more deeply and dynamically. More significantly, it was observed that lengthy discussions and deliberations were exemplified as an internal justice mechanism between community members, as a way to ensure each other's needs and concerns were taken into consideration before any decisions were made. In order for the design process to be community-led and facilitate community agency, justice-oriented design listening requires that design sessions align with the pace set by community members rather than by the research agenda. We find that a slower mode of engagement results in a finer, more sensitive attunement of the participatory design practitioner to community needs and preferences. The researcher's capacity for responsiveness to community needs is built in an extended period of slow, intentional, and non-extractive interaction that does not necessarily result in direct answers to any preconceived research questions. It's important to note that feedback on the pace of engagements will not always be verbally communicated. So it's important for the participatory design practitioner to constantly be tuning into the body language, enthusiasm or lack thereof, and resistance of community members to design activities. Importantly, the ability to listen over a sustained period of time, not just during the course of the project, but also within individual design sessions, was essential. Through the mode of pace, we highlight the importance of receptiveness and stamina within the designer. The receptiveness to preferred pacing and the stamina to stay focused and engaged during long conversations whilst refraining from interfering with the process of discussion that unfolds. Lastly, transformation. This is an act that remakes practices of iteration and adaptation as tasks in between community engagements to actively rethink artifact designs. The listening insight here is twofold. Firstly, community response, both positive and negative, comes from how the designer moves with the shared knowledge between sessions. We find that acknowledging and giving space for this in-betweenness or transformation prevents the designer from becoming fixed to certain ideas or positions. Instead, the designer must respond to the constantly shifting rhythm of the relational context and conditions. Secondly, we find that the approach of transformation to addressing justices of labour imposed on community members during design session. All methods, due to their ubiquitous nature and community interactions, appeared less fatiguing and confronting. They did not require community members to spend time addressing areas of knowledge or ways of being that were uncomfortable to them, such as drawing or prototyping. Additionally, moving the heavy design work to the in-between and incorporating the learnings from pace allowed community members ample time and agency to critique, comment, and ideate orally during the design session. Transformation is a dialogic approach, core to our conception of justice-oriented design listening. The designer is always in conversation with community members, not just mirroring back what they've said, but transforming it into something new. Whilst the iterative nature of emergent designs is familiar to participatory design practitioners, we find that transformation in this way is required in order to build trust with community members. Whilst the result of iterative approaches are seen to be co-interpreted by the designer and the participants, transformation requires the designer to take the oral contributions of community members and through active listening turn them into new tangible ideas that the community members can interact with and orally iterate on in further sessions. Through these modes, we offer a practical set of reflections and recommendations to help designers center non-Western ways of thinking and being to facilitate culturally appropriate co-design engagements when developing and deploying conservation technology. We argue that just as much as a diversity of voices must be heard within participatory design, the way those voices are heard and listened to is crucial to enable participatory design practice to be more equitable and in line with justice and decolonising agendas. Justice-oriented design listening is not just about designers hearing community members, but about entering into dialogues that transform design projects and practices towards more equitable and just processes and outcomes. Such an approach engages with the plurality of voices and cultural specificity that inform design projects, but also being open to modification. Listening to the forest in this way involves more than just measuring and monitoring biodiversity, but instead requires tuning in to a multiplicity of forest worldviews and worlds. Thank you.